Hey guys, Property Point Customs here. This is my 2012 Chevy Equinox, and just below the rear window there was a rust bubble forming. It's kind of hard to zoom in, but just below where the glass meets the metal. So what I did is I sanded down the rust bubble to bare metal. It was just surface rust, and it was causing the paint to bubble. And this is actually a repair that was done at the dealership a couple years ago, so it came back. So what I did is I sanded it down, and then I cleaned it off, and I put a couple coats of its Dupli-Color color match touch-up paint. So I put 2 coats of the black to fill in where it was kind of a divot where the paint was removed down to bare metal, and then I put a 3 coats of this. Actually has a clear coat too in it in the silver part, so you take it off, it has a little foam applicator, and I put 3 coats of clear coat on it. And what I'm going to do is let this dry overnight, and if I can zoom in a little bit, not really picking it up too well. However, the clear coat's a little higher than the factory paint right now, so my next step is to let this dry overnight. So I'm going to let it dry for about 18 hours, and then I'm going to wet sand it with 1000 grit sandpaper, and then I'll go up to 2000 grit to smooth out the surface so it's flush with the regular paint on the tailgate, and then I'll cut and buff it to bring it back. My main concern is to make sure there's no outstanding rust, and then I don't want people to know that this was actually a repair job. In other words, it's almost like blending in your paint. You want to repair it, but you don't want anybody to know that it actually had to be repaired. So the clear coat's dry now. So this is a piece of 1000 grit sandpaper. So what I'm going to do is I have a little thing of water up here. I'm just going to wet it down really good, and then I've taped it off because I don't want to sand into the other part of the paint. I just want to sand the higher edges of the clear coat. So I'm just lightly sanding, just trying to get rid of some of the edges, the high spots in the clear coat. Actually, even a little bit like that actually seems really nice. A little bit of the black bled through. I don't want to take off too much. So that was with the 1000 grit sandpaper. I'm going to take 2000 grit. Same thing. I'm going to wet it again. And this is just smoothing out the high spots. Of course, it's probably not going to look perfect, but it's going to be a lot better than having a large blistered paint. I can even feel like it's not high there now. A little bit up underneath of the back window needs to come down a little bit. You can see the difference. Almost like you get a little bit of the orange peel and the high spots. It actually looks a lot better. And the next step after this, I'm going to take off the tape and see how it looks. So I've got the tape all off, and I was just checking to make sure it's nice and smooth. That's actually a little piece of tape stuck underneath there, and it's nice and smooth. My next step is I'm out of my cutting compounds, so I have my Marine RV one-step cleaner wax. It's a little heavier wax than your normal regular wax for actually cleaning a gel coat on a sailboat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a couple coats of this to give it a little buff. This is a little more aggressive than just regular Mother's wax. And then I'll probably end up getting out the high-speed buffer later on and giving this a nice little buff. Guys, so I sanded it down and buffed it out. I still noticed that there was a little bit of a lower dip where the paint had been taken off, so I've applied another 2 coats of clear coat to build it up. So next thing again is wet sand it with 1000, 2000 grit, and then after that I'm going to buff it with my Simonized buffer. So I used the 1000 grit and 2000 grit, so starting to get smoother, but I can still feel a little bit of an edge right there. So I got to go a little heavier with the 2000 grit to take her down a little bit more. So it's been sanded down, so the next thing is to put the wax on and then buff it with the high-speed buffer. This is my Simonized buffer with the purple pad on it. So I put a lot of wax on it. So the next thing to do is to go over it with the high-speed buffer and start buffing out some of those scratches from sanding. Alright guys, it's all done. Turned out pretty good. I will say one thing that I did notice is the rear hatch was painted at the dealership at one time, and when I bought the touch-up paint, I got the factory color. So this is a 2012, and the rear hatch was painted, I believe, 3 years ago. So it's got 3 years of fading on a black paint, and I do notice that there is a little bit of a difference in paint color from where I painted and the rear hatch paint. Really, it's not too noticeable. The only person that will probably notice will be me, just because I know I had touched up that area. But overall, it turned out pretty good. I mean, I probably would have spent a couple $100 because they would have repainted either the rear hatch or they would have painted this area here and kind of blended it in down through. So overall, I ended up having to cut the paint and sand it probably 3 or 4 times till I got it so I couldn't notice any edges. Like I said, you will notice a little bit of difference in paint color, but it's nice and smooth. There's no edges where the clear coat ends and meets the factory paint. I will say one thing: when they repainted this, it almost looks like they went with a one-stage paint. In other words, it looks like it was painted black, and I would say if they put clear coat on, they didn't put much on, because it looks like it was starting to bleed through a little bit when I was wet sanding it. So I'm not going to do any more cut and buffing. So after I was done that, I put a finishing wax on it, and overall I'm pretty pleased with it. I do notice a little spot here. You get a lot of water running down between this trim piece and the back glass. So I noticed a little spot right there, so that'll probably be my next area I'll do eventually. Anyways guys, thanks for watching. A few things to sum up that I used was my Real Satin Marine one-step wax. Works great as a cutting compound. I used my 1000 and 2000 grits sandpaper. I finished it off with a Tropical Gold Carnauba finishing wax. And on the floor I have my Simonized buffer. That's what I used. I will say one thing, if you try to buff out the scratches from the wet sanding process by hand, it is very hard. With a buffer, it takes them out within seconds, so it's well worth it. Anyways guys, thanks for watching. Just a little quick video on something that you can all do in your garage. I'm certainly not a professional. I'm sure there's people that would do it a lot better and probably would have painted. And that would probably be my next step down the road, is actually getting into actually painting body panels. Anyways guys, thanks for watching. If you have any comments, certainly leave them below. And if you like this sort of video, you may want to consider subscribing. Take care.